Help support the show by joining the Patreon or becoming a YouTube member. Also, hit that like button and subscribe if you want more Browns-focused content. If you have watched my coverage of the Cleveland Browns over the last couple of years, you are pretty unsurprised by the news that dropped today that Deshaun Watson restructured his contract. Now, what he's doing here is very specific because right now he's not doing a salary reduction, or not a salary reduction, a cap number reduction, right? Where they reduce the cap number for the upcoming season, because you can't do that until the start of the league new year. I'm pretty sure whatever he did today will certainly do that once the league new year starts. But for right now, all that's been affected immediately is just they've added a couple of dummy years to Deshaun Watson's contract. So it's not like they extended him or anything like this. This was a very expected move. And if you are a Browns fan who wants to see this team recover from that contract, this is actually the path that you want them to do going forward, because what isn't an option with a fully guaranteed contract is just outright cutting it, because that means all the money left that hasn't been accounted for in the salary cap would accelerate to whatever year you cut it, and that would mean that cutting Deshaun Watson would cost you like $100 million in cap space or something like that. So you want them to be smart about this and spread this out over time. What they did today with this contract is a huge step in that direction. Now, to some folk who are used to kind of dealing with the salary cap in a more traditional way, that might not make sense. What I hope to do in this video is make this make sense, because this does make a ton of sense why the Browns are doing it. And it also doesn't mean that the Browns plan to start Deshaun Watson next year or the year after. I think it's very likely that they do this restructure with Watson, and then next offseason, on post June 1st, they make the decision to cut Deshaun Watson. But we'll see how everything plays out. Here's why the Browns did it. First is the report from Tom Pelissero, right? The adjustment to Deshaun Watson's contract doesn't impact his salary right now. He says, which can happen later, which means once the new league year starts, the Browns will make adjustments to his 2025 cap number. It's just right now you're in league year 2024. You can't restructure to adjust that. This is just getting some work done ahead of time. It lets the Browns spread the cap hit at the end of the contract, which expires in 2026. Strong sign that Watson will be on the Cleveland Browns for at least 2 more years. Again, 2 more league years. So the start of league year 2025, he's definitely going to be on the roster. Start of league year 2026, he will be, but that doesn't mean post June 1st, he won't be cut, which I think is the case. The reason I think that's the case is based on how the salary cap works, and also if you've studied how the Browns like to manipulate the salary cap since Andrew Berry has got there. And they do a good job of doing that, because every year we think that the Browns are screwed with cap space, and every year we talk about the Browns having more cap space than we expected, right? Like right now, people assume the Browns are in cap hell. The Browns have like $40+ million in cap space right now, right? That's due to how well they've been able to manipulate the salary cap. Now, Jack DUFFIN, who works for the OBR, which I also work for at times, wrote a great article about this. I'm going to link in the description below that really does help explain things, but I'll walk you guys through it here. They might want to get a Watson deal in the building with a slight amendment to his contract to add a 2027 year onto it. They would change the contract, so on the third day of the 2027 league year, he receives a $100 million roster bonus or something similar to that, then give him a league minimum base salary. That allows the team to give him a post-June 1st cut once the new league year starts and spread the final dead cap over the next 2 years. In theory, it could be a $1 billion roster bonus. They just want something large enough that the team will cut the player. So basically what this is saying is that they're going to add a year to his contract, give him no base salary or guaranteed money in that year of his contract, and then make his roster bonus so big that nobody's going to be incentivized to keep him on the roster. You're going to be incentivized to cut him. And since none of that money is guaranteed, none of that money will hit the cap. What this is here to do is to kind of get around the NFL's void year limits, where I think you're only allowed to have 5 years of the contract on void years. This is a way to get around the void year limit and add an extra year where you can effectively spread money down the line and all of that. Like that's what that mechanism is there for. That's why dummy years are different than void years, because dummy years, which the Browns have used before, I think on Jadeveon Clowney's contract, are there to kind of get around the limitations with void years. Again, because the salary cap goes up about 8 to 10% every year, the longer you can spread out a cap hit, the less percentage that contract over time will take up of your salary cap, which is why a lot of NFL teams do this. Now, if you're familiar with what the Browns have been doing over the last few years, all of that will make sense. But if you aren't and you have questions and you're wondering, I don't know, why is it that the Browns want to spread this contract out further? Does it feel like you're just dealing with it longer? Well, here's why. Well, the thing in the NFL is that the salary cap goes up every year. About 8 to 10%, the salary cap goes up. So unlike when you're dealing with debit, right, or credit, where it's always more financially beneficial to you to pay out any debt you have quicker than later, because there is a penalty that you're going to get in the form of interest, right? Now, I've said it before in this video that the salary cap goes up 8 to 10% every year. Why is that the case? Well, the salary cap is adjusted every year with league revenues, and league revenues tend to rise about 8 to 10%, which means that the salary cap goes up about 8 to 10%. For an example of a situation where league revenues didn't rise is the pandemic. That was the only time in recent memory where league revenues did not go up, and that happening again would have a disastrous effect on the salary cap. But think about that. The last time league revenues didn't go up was when the world shut down. So outside of a once-in-a-lifetime event shutting the cap down, or shutting the league down and shutting the world down, revenues are likely to continue to go on this path with the NFL specifically. Now, because the salary cap goes up 8 to 10%, that changes the relationship that teams have with contracts and cap hits, right? Remember when Pat Mahomes signed a 10-year contract and people were clowning at it at the beginning, but then it ended up being a really good deal? Remember how we used to freak out, or how Steeler fans used to freak out about Big Ben's cap hits, but that never ended up yielding any disaster for Pittsburgh because it kind of just went away? Well, this is why it goes away, because the salary cap goes up. And yeah, there's going to be a big scary number there every once in a while, but you can restructure that number and spread it out over time and make it so that that number's really not that big of a deal when it comes to your ability to spend on the salary cap. A lot of us think of the salary cap a lot like we think about our own personal, like, credit debit situations, right? And natural human instinct tells you that if you get something, it's better for you to pay it off now than let it sit, because if you let it sit, that money's going to be, you're going to pay more money over time because of how interest attacks those payments. So if I bought a TV on credit and it was $1,000 when I bought it, but I have, X% interest rate, that TV could end up costing me $1,200 if I pay it off over 5 years instead of just the $1,000 if I paid it off away. And this is kind of how a lot of people instinctually think about the salary cap, and they use those same principles with the salary cap. But in the NFL, because the cap goes up every year, it actually functions in the opposite way, where you're incentivized to let money go down the road instead of paying the money off as soon as possible. Because the salary cap continues to go up, that means that $46 million in 2022 would be 22% of your salary cap. But if you fast forward all the way to 2026, that same $46 million would be worth 15.4% of your salary cap. You get what I mean? Another thing to remember is that what you get charged on the cap is not what you're paying that player that year. It's just how you choose to account for that money that year. So you can have major fluctuations with your cap number, right? As long as it all adds up to the total value of Deshaun Watson's contract. So the Browns can stretch out Deshaun Watson's contract for an extra 4 years and lower those cap hits for that amount of time. And as long as it all adds up to $230 million at the end of it, and all of that money gets accounted for eventually on the salary cap, then it's all good, whether he's on the roster or not. What that ends up meaning is that that cap number that you see and that people, will bring up and talk about is actually the most malleable number and can be changed very easily as long as the team is willing to kick the can down the road and willing to spend the cash to do that. And fortunately for the Browns, Jimmy Haslam is willing to spend the cash to kick the can down the road to make sure the Browns salary cap situation doesn't become a disaster. So what that ends up meaning is that the cap number that you see that people will point to and say that it's inevitable or freak out about, that ends up being the most meaningless number to talk about when we're talking about the future of a player's contract, because that number, that cap number, can be manipulated if you have void years, if you have dummy years, and your team is incentivized to do so because, again, pushing money down the line and spreading it out over multiple years, extended period of time, is actually a more financially sound way to operate in the NFL when it comes to not eating up all of your salary cap on one player or the other. Now, remember what I said earlier, where a lot of people look at the salary cap like personal finance. And in personal finance, you're incentivized not to kick the can down the road because you could buy $1,000 TV on credit, pay it off over 5 years, and end up paying $1,300 for it when it only costs $1,000 to begin with. Now, imagine how different the scenario would be if, instead of being punished for kicking the can down the road, if you bought $1,000 TV and they said, hey, you actually want to pay the payments on this and spread it out over 5 years, because if you do that, it would be like you bought the TV for $770. That's what the NFL salary cap is like, and why a lot of teams kick the can down the road, because it's basically like a credit card with reverse interest. You're incentivized to let money sit over time and spread it out versus paying it all in one go if you're a team that's trying to spend on the salary cap. Now, there are some teams that don't want to spend a ton of cash, so they will opt to get rid of it earlier or quicker. But if you're a team like the Browns, who have demonstrated that they don't have a problem spending cash, then this is exactly how you want to operate. If we look at this chart, this first row right here is the salary cap hits and the percentage of the salary cap, which is the most important thing, right? This first row. If Deshaun Watson never restructured any of his contracts, then this is with the restructure. But if you stop restructuring after 2023, and then this is what the cap percentages look like if you restructure every year. And this is what the restructure looks like with the dummy year and the post June 1st. So the percentages are what's important here, right? So $46 million in 2022 is 22% of your salary cap. But that same $46 million in 2026 is 15.44% of your salary cap. So it's the same amount of money, but because this number over here, right, the salary cap continues to rise, the percentage of the cap that takes up is less and less and less and less over time. Now, the Browns traded for Deshaun Watson. They wanted to be competitive immediately. So they restructured this deal so that they took up even less of the cap early on, knowing that they can kick the can down the road and never get past a certain percentage with him, right? So this is what the Browns have been doing, right? So 2022, he was only worth about less than 5% of your cap. 2023, he was worth less about 9% of your cap, and then you jump here to this column over here, and you can see that Deshaun Watson was about 11% of the cap this year. The reason you want to restructure him is because, and add the dummy year is, look, you get him at 13% of the cap this year. Next year, he would be 15% of the cap, 11% of the cap, 15% of the cap. You can work around that. Versus if you just stop restructuring him entirely, then you get like a year here where he's 23, 21% of the cap, right? 25% of the cap. The number of the cap that you're taking up changes. And that's like a $30 million difference between 25% of the cap and 15% of the cap. So if you're in a position where you have a bad contract that you have to mitigate the effect of, this is the best way to do it, because spreading that money out means that you're going to pay less of a percentage on the cap over time. Just save yourself more cap space over time. Now, obviously, the best thing would have been if he never signed that contract, or if the Browns never offered him that contract to begin with. But you can't live in the past, right? You got to figure out how to solve the problem that's in front of you. This is the best way to solve the problem that's in front of you. Again, it's the opposite relationship that you have with credit. But what that allows you to do is sign and retain a lot of the talent that you have, right? This is why they're able to keep Grant Delpit. This is why they were able to extend Myles Garrett and Denzel Ward and not worry about the quarterback contract. This is why they are able to extend JOK, right? David Njoku. Why they'll be able to retain whatever young talent they get in the draft, because they have been able to manipulate the cap in this way to make sure that they're never over a certain percentage of the cap being spent on just Deshaun Watson alone. This may be a bit of a complicated process to understand, but once you do, you get that the Browns are actually saving themselves some grief by working with the contract like this. Now, it's easy to misinterpret this. It's easy for people to grab certain details of this and make it seem like something it's not, right? I'm pretty sure we're going to see our fair share of articles acting as if the Browns gave this man an extension. That is not what happened, right? Or that kicking the can down the road is not a sound strategy, but it is. The only thing that can knock a hole in this strategy if something happens that takes the salary cap down. And right now, the only thing that's happened recently that's ever taken the salary cap down was the pandemic. Like, that's the level of event that has to happen. So that's to shut down the world for the salary cap to go down. So barring something like that happening, this is going to be a viable, stable strategy that plenty of teams have used. The Steelers did this with Big Ben all the time. Gave him a signing bonus, restructured it, kicked it down the road. Remember how the last couple of years of Big Ben, we thought the Steelers were doomed because they owed like a ridiculous amount of money for Ben on the salary cap for like a year or two, and then it never ended up being a problem because they just restructured and kicked the can down the road? That's exactly what the Browns are doing with the Deshaun Watson contract, right? So as far as the salary cap goes, the Browns will be fine with salary cap space. They're not going to have to sell off players to free up space or anything like that. This is why they're not going to have to do that, is because they have these kind of mechanisms in place to manage the salary cap. It's why I say don't overreact to future cap hits, because it's always possible that the team can restructure or knock down those cap hits with extensions. And oftentimes when you see a ridiculous cap hit, right, in a contract, that's usually a signifier for whoever's extending that contract to know, okay, this is the time to work an extension, so we don't have that number and we can lower that number, spread it out over time. This is how contracts work in the NFL. This is why it's not as simple as going on a salary cap website, looking at the cap hit and freaking out about it. This is what the Browns are doing. They're spreading the money out over time. Because the cap goes up, that means the percentage of the cap being spent every time goes down, which is why the Browns are operating the way that they're operating, and ultimately why this is a better way to operate, especially if you're in a league like the NFL, where the cap raising, where revenue's going up, seems to be as sure as a bet as anything. Let me know if there's anything else that needs to be clarified in the comment section below. But that's what the Browns are doing. They're spreading this money out so that they don't get themselves handcuffed in just 1 year where they can't do anything, right? They don't get that 27% of the cap is being spun up on a player who's not here year with Deshaun Watson in like 2027, where you're spending like $89 million. You're spreading that money out over time because the cap goes up. When the cap goes up, the money and the percentage that money takes goes down. So it's reverse interest. Let me know what y'all think in the comment section below. Y'all have a great day. Have an even better night. Peace.